Okay, so get this, we're diving into leadership. All that sciencey stuff about how people rise to power.
Oh, yeah, and why we decide to follow them.
Yeah, why we follow them.
It's really wild when you think about how much of it's like built into us.
You mean like biological?
Yeah,
Broke
like
it down.
evolution didn't just shape our bodies. It had shaped our behavior.
Okay, so like leadership is in our genes.
In a way, yeah, any characteristic that's even a little bit influenced by genes can be shaped by natural selection.
So like a tiny bit. So it's not all about just being the strongest or fastest.
Right, like survival of the fittest, but for social skills.
So there's a survival advantage to being a good leader or a good follower?
Exactly. Think about early humans. They had to coordinate hunts.
Oh yeah, and protect themselves.
The groups that had members who could step up and lead, yeah, they would have had a way better chance of surviving and passing on their genes.
And those genes would include the leadership ones.
Exactly. Over time, those leadership qualities would become more common.
This makes me think about hierarchy. Like, we see it everywhere. In animal groups, human societies, is there an evolutionary reason for that?
It all comes down to minimizing conflict.
Oh, interesting.
Conflict within the group is bad for survival.
Makes sense.
Imagine a group with no social order whatsoever.
Oh gosh, just chaos.
Total chaos, constant fighting over resources, mates. It would be a mess. But hierarchy, it establishes a kind of pecking order.
I mean, it sounds a little brutal, but
It does, but it actually reduces those conflicts and helps the group function.
so smoother running.
Way smoother.
Okay, but we both know the leader isn't always the biggest or strongest. How do we choose who to follow then?
That's where things get really interesting. There's this whole spectrum of leadership styles. Yeah, and the type of leader that emerges really depends on the challenges the group is facing. We can think about it in terms of dominance versus prestige.
Dominance versus prestige.
So a dominant leader is the one who takes charge, often using force or intimidation.
to get things done.
Right, like those classic command and control bosses.
Oh, I've definitely had a few bosses like that.
Not exactly inspiring, but then you have prestige leaders.
Prestige leaders, okay.
These are the folks who earn their influence through knowledge, skills, or even their generosity.
So it's like they have something to offer.
Yeah. Think about those mentors or experts that people just naturally want to follow.
Because they have something valuable. Different situations call for different types of leaders.
Exactly. There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
And to figure out which type of leader is favored, you have to think about what challenges they're facing.
Exactly. And there are two key challenges that come into play here: coordination and collective action.
Okay, break those down for me. Coordination seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah, everyone wants the same thing.
But the how is the problem.
Exactly. It's like when you and your friends are trying to pick a restaurant. Everyone's hungry, wants to eat, but no one can agree where to go.
Simple, goal, complicated process.
And then you have collective action problems.
Sure.
This is all about the temptation to free ride.
It's a free ride on others' efforts.
Exactly. You still reap the benefits, though.
I know this one from school group projects. Someone slacks off, but everyone gets the same grade.
Exactly. And when you have situations where there's a high risk of that freeloading,
Or conflict with another group.
exactly, then we tend to prefer those dominant leaders.
Makes sense. They can enforce the rules.
They enforce cooperation, keep everyone in line, even if they have to be a bit tough.
So thinking about those early humans, again, facing a rival tribe or a predator,
Yeah.
a strong leader would be key.
A decisive leader, even an aggressive one, might be seen as the best bet for survival.
This makes me wonder if we're kind of hardwired to prefer those strong, decisive leaders, even if those traits aren't the best fit for everything in our world now.
It's true, like physical strength isn't really a requirement for leading a company.
Or a country.
Exactly. You've hit on something called evolutionary mismatch.
Evolutionary mismatch.
Our evolved preferences for certain leadership traits might not always be the best fit for modern society.
So are our instincts about good leaders just wrong then?
Well, not necessarily. It's not like we're just robots running on our genes. We have culture to consider, too.
So it's more than just biology.
Way more. Our culture shapes and molds those innate preferences that we have.
So it's like nature and nurture working together.
Exactly. And that explains why leadership can look so different across different cultures,
Right.
like large, complex societies.
It ones with a lot of inequality.
Yeah, they often favor strong directive leaders, but then you look at smaller societies.
And ones that are more egalitarian.
Right, those societies might lean towards leaders with more specialized knowledge.
So it's like our genes provide the base, and then culture adds all the flavor on top.
I like that analogy. But even with this nuanced view, we can't ignore the gender gap in leadership. How do we explain that persistent disparity?
Yeah, it's a tough one. Is it biology or is it culture?
It's probably a mix of both. plus societal structures. Some evolutionary theories suggest that men might be biologically predisposed to leadership. It goes back to that male warrior hypothesis.
Yeah, physical strength, competing for resources and mates.
Right, but we can't forget about cultural norms and institutions. They play a huge role too.
So biology might lay some groundwork.
It might set the stage, but those societal structures and expectations, they amplify the gap.
So we need policies that address those unequal opportunities.
Stereotypical expectations about who's considered leader material. They limit women's access to networks, opportunities, all of it.
It's like they're facing these invisible obstacles.
Exactly. And on top of that, there are the double standards. Research has shown that male CEOs are often seen as more competent if they have attractive partners.
Okay.
But female CEOs are actually penalized for the same thing.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? It's all about those deeply ingrained biases, often unconscious ones. We need to address those biases, challenge those double standards, create a more level playing field.
So leadership potential isn't limited.
So closing that gender gap isn't just the right thing to do.
It's the smart thing to do. Exactly. And it goes back to that idea we were talking about earlier.
About how effective leadership is context dependent.
Exactly. There's no single ideal leader for every situation.
So what works in one context might not work in another.
Exactly. And as our world keeps changing at this crazy pace,
that adaptability becomes even more crucial. This makes me think about technology, like AI. How does that impact the future of leadership?
that's the million-dollar question. It's a question we're only starting to explore.
But it has big implications.
Huge implications. On one hand, AI has the potential to make leadership better.
In what way?
It can help us make better decisions, process information more efficiently, automate tasks.
So it's like having a superpowered assistant.
But there's a potential downside too. AI could create a detachment between leaders and followers.
Because if decisions are made by algorithms...
It erodes that human connection.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then there's the issue of trust.
Right. Will people willingly follow an AI?
Even if it's more rational.
Exactly. Even if it's giving objectively better recommendations.
It goes back to that evolutionary mismatch thing.
It does. Our brains are wired for face-to-face interaction, social cues.
We might struggle to adapt to this new world.
A world where leadership is more data-driven, less personal.
So it's a challenge for future leaders.
A big one. They'll have to figure out how to use AI.
While still preserving those human elements.
Things like vision, empathy, communication, the ability to inspire trust.
What about charisma? Will that become even more important in a tech-driven world?
That's an interesting thought, charisma. That ability to draw people in, inspire them. It's always been a potent force in leadership, and in a world where technology might create distance, it's like a counterbalance, the warmth and connection of a charismatic leader.
It could soften that coldness.
Exactly, the coldness of a purely data-driven approach.
So what are the key takeaways here? What can people take with them into their lives?
Well, first we have to remember that leadership isn't one size fits all.
Right. Different types of leadership, different situations.
Each with its own strengths and weaknesses. There's no one right way to lead.
So we shouldn't try to copy someone else's style.
No. You need to understand the dynamics of this situation. Adapt your approach.
Makes sense. What else?
And second, remember that leadership isn't about power over others. It's about influence and empowerment, helping people reach their full potential.
Not command and control.
Right. Effective leaders inspire, motivate, guide.
It's collaboration, not domination.
Exactly. And finally, we have to understand that leadership is always evolving. As our world changes, so do the challenges we face and the type of leadership needed.
And by understanding where leadership comes from, we can create better, more ethical, more human-centered forms of leadership. This whole discussion has really got me thinking about those born leaders we hear about. Are they really just born with it or what?
It's not just about having some magical set of qualities, it's more than that.
Okay, so it's not all in the genes.
It's this mix of genes, environment, and culture that creates those individuals who just seem to naturally step into those leadership roles.
But they aren't always the most effective.
Right. Just because someone's a natural leader doesn't mean they're going to thrive in every single situation.
Like someone who might be great in a fast-paced startup might not do so well in a more traditional setting.
Exactly. Different contexts demand different skills.
So self-awareness is really important.
Super important. You need to know your strengths, your weaknesses, and recognize those situations where you'll shine and where you might struggle.
It's like finding your leadership sweet spot.
I like that. It's about knowing yourself, seeking out those roles that really play to your strengths. Become a master of your domain.
Okay, so you found your sweet spot. What's next?
What's important to remember that leadership isn't a solo act.
Okay, so you can't just do it all yourself.
Right. It's about building those strong relationships with your followers, understanding what motivates them, and empowering them to do their best work.
It's all about collaboration.
Absolutely. And if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, it makes perfect sense. Our ancestors survived because they worked together, shared knowledge, cooperated. Those collaborative instincts are still with us today.
Even though we tend to focus on the individual leader.
Right. But leadership is truly a collective endeavor.
This has been so insightful. We've explored so much about leadership.
The past, the present, the future. I think the most important thing to remember is that leadership is ultimately about service. It's about using your influence to help others to create positive change to make a difference. Whether you're leading a team or a community project or just trying to be a good person.
It's a purpose we can all get behind.
So the next time you're in a position to lead, remember what we talked about today.
Adapt your approach, empower others, keep the big picture in mind.
Because effective leadership isn't about climbing a ladder or personal gain. On the world around you, that's what really matters.
That's a great note to end on.
Go out there, make a difference. Maybe even inspire the next generation of leaders. Who knows what's possible?
Thanks for joining us today on this deep dive into leadership.
It's been a pleasure.